Good evening. Welcome to this episode of Cocktails with a Curator. I'm Xavier Salomon, the Deputy Director and Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator at the Frick Collection. This evening, I am going to talk about a small, exquisite, mysterious sculpture which was acquired by Henry Clay Frick in 1916, together with a large group of bronze sculptures which he bought from the collection of J.P. Morgan. After J.P. Morgan's death, Frick acquired a number of objects from that collection, and the bronze sculptures were among the most significant groups of objects in that collection that Frick acquired. This is Bertoldo di Giovanni's shield bearer. It usually lives in the enamels gallery at the Frick. You see the vitrine at the end, surrounded by many of the gold grounds that were acquired by Helen Clay Frick, by Frick's daughter. And you see in the vitrine a Maiolica dish, a series of enamels, objects, and small bronzes by Andrea Riccio, by Antico, and on the right, under the Maiolica dish, you can see the small Bertoldo di Giovanni shield bearer. The shield bearer was also the poster boy recently of the last exhibition we did at the Frick, which took place between September of 2019 and January 2020, and focused for the first time on Bertoldo di Giovanni as an artist. This was the first monographic exhibition on Bertoldo that ever took place, and we managed to reunite almost all of his existing works. There are only about 25 works that are securely given to him or attributed to him, and all of them for those few months were together at the Frick Collection, which was a really extraordinary experience. But our own shield bearer, as I mentioned, was the key image of the show. Because we're going to be talking about an exotic and strange subject matter, and I will discuss that in some more detail during this talk, I decided to pair it today with an exotic cocktail and also a very summery cocktail. So I am drinking Daiquiri. Daiquiris were invented supposedly in the late 19th century in Cuba. There is a beach and a silver mine called Daiquiri, and apparently this drink was invented near there, and it's white rum, lime juice, and sugar served in a chilled cup. It is very refreshing and a great summery drink, but it was also, yet again, as we discussed many times in this series, a medicinal drink. A similar type of drink, mixing rum and lime or lemon juice, was served all the way through the 18th century on Navy ships across the world to prevent scurvy. So the combination of alcohol and citrus juice was considered medicinal and helped prevent scurvy on board of the ships. So I hope you enjoy your daiquiri and you're enjoying your summer, and we're gonna raise a glass to Bertoldo di Giovanni. So what is the shield bearer? As the name suggests, this is a figure holding a shield. And here you see this man standing almost entirely nude, holding with his right hand a shield. With his left hand, he clutches a club. And as we look around this figure, more details emerge. This is a very small bronze, very small in size, was originally entirely gilded, and you can see some remnants of that gilding across the surface of the figure. He is naked, but he also has a series of sort of tendrils and leaves of wine leaves wrapped around his body. You see it going across his chest and around his belly. As you move around, you realize that there are other details to the sculpture. So for example, you can see in the sort of thick curly hair of this figure, just above his forehead, two tiny little sort of curving horns. So he has horns coming out of his forehead. And as you turn it around, you can see these vine leaves and tendrils sort of wrapping around his body. But also you can see that just above his backside, there is a little tail. So he is tailed and has horns. And to the left, you also see a set of panpipes that are just under his proper left arm. So what do these details tell us? And it is very difficult to actually identify what this figure represents and what this figure is, as we will see in a second. Bertoldo di Giovanni is a fascinating artist. The Frick exhibition was the very first exhibition dedicated to him. He is usually seen as a link between Donatello and Michelangelo. He was one of the pupils of Donatello. We don't quite know how he worked with Donatello, but we know he probably trained with him, and he definitely worked in collaboration with Donatello when Donatello was an old man. And Bertoldo was born in Florence, but was of German origins. His parents were both German, and they were involved with the textile industry in Oltrarno, which is the other side of the Arno from the center of Florence. So Bertoldo probably trained with Donatello and very quickly came into the orbit of the Medici family. He was also one of Michelangelo's masters in some way. And even though this probably wasn't a well-organized training, we know that Michelangelo collaborated as a young man with other artists in the Giardino di San Marco, a garden that was created by the Medici family for their collection of antiquities and where young students could go and study antiquities. And Bertoldo acted as a kind of curator of that garden. We know fairly little about Bertoldo's life. We don't know much about his private life. He never married. We know quite a lot about him through criminal records because he seemed to have had a habit of not paying his rent. And over again, he appears in documents as not paying his rent and being evicted, and the Medici family stepping in constantly to pay his debts. Finally, the Medicis decide to take him into his palace. And when Bertoldo dies in 1491, at the end of that year, he is living in the Medici palace, and he actually dies at the villa of Poggio a Caiano, Lorenzo il Magnifico's favorite villa, just outside of Florence towards Prato. His life is directly connected to that of Lorenzo il Magnifico, and Lorenzo is the greatest patron of Bertoldo. Many of his works, as far as we know, were created for Lorenzo or as gift for Lorenzo to distribute to other rulers. Here you see a fresco from the 17th century by Ottavio Vannini. This is in the Pitti Palace in Florence, and it shows a 17th century view of the great patronage of Lorenzo il Magnifico. And you see Lorenzo in a garden. This is a made-up garden, but could well be the garden of St. Mark's, surrounded by a number of artists. There are sculptors on the right, there are architects on the left. You see on the very, very left, Giuliano da Sangallo, who was Lorenzo's favorite architect, who is presenting a plan he has under his arm of the villa of Poggio a Caiano, the same place where Bertoldo will die, and where he will also execute a very important frieze for the facade of the villa. The young man on the right, instead, is the young Michelangelo, presenting a bust of a satyr to Lorenzo, one of the earliest works we know, according to Michelangelo's biographers, that the artist made for Lorenzo il Magnifico. We don't have a single portrait of Bertoldo. We cannot give a face to Bertoldo. So I like to imagine that one of these people in this crowd could well have been Bertoldo. And the fact that we don't have a portrait is just one of the many details of his life that we wish we knew more about, but unfortunately remains involved in darkness. We don't know much about it. So our exhibition was a research project which went back to the original sources on Bertoldo. We looked at every single document that we know from contemporary times, from the 15th century, about Bertoldo, and those are published in the exhibition catalog. But we also went back to Wilhelm von Bode, who in the 19th century was the great first Bertoldo scholar in Germany and Berlin, and more recently to James Draper, who was a curator at the Metropolitan Museum, who unfortunately passed away last year, but he was the great Bertoldo scholar and published in the 1990s, still the greatest and most useful Bertoldo monograph in existence. So we reunited all the works of Bertoldo, but the starting point in many ways was the shield bearer at the Frick. There were so many questions about this object, and the starting point was the idea of reuniting this object with two other objects that had been connected to it at different points. One is this other shield bearer, and this is in the Liechtenstein collection in Vienna. And as you look at it, you realize that it's pretty much the same figure as our shield bearer. He looks maybe a little older. His beard is fuller than the facial hair on the Frick shield bearer. He also has these vine leaves and vine tendrils around his body. He's also nude. He's also holding a shield, and he's also holding a club. The two main differences, however, are that, well, apart from being older as a figure, the Liechtenstein shield bearer does not have any horns that we can see of on his forehead. And also, when we turn it around and look at it at the back, there are no panpipes and definitely no tail. So what do these two figures represent? Earlier on, Bode connected these two to a third sculpture by Bertoldo, and this is the Hercules on horseback in the Gallerie Estensi in Modena. This is probably an object that was commissioned by the Duke of Ferrara and Modena, Ercole d'Este, and Ercole, his obvious namesake was Hercules, the mythical hero of antiquity. It's sort of strange to imagine Hercules on horseback, but this does appear in Este-related iconography from the time. And here you see clearly Hercules bearded with the lion skin, typical attribute around his body, with a club that he's holding in his hand, and with festoons of fruit and vegetables. And this was probably related to a series of ceremonies that took place in Ferrara, where we know the Duke traveled across the city dressed up as Hercules, and there were Herculean figures all over the city. So Bode and then Draper suggested that the Hercules was probably part of a group of 3 sculptures that were to be shown together, Hercules at the center and the 2 shield bearers on each side. In the exhibition at the Frick, we reunited these objects. What you see in this room are fragments of the frieze from Poggia Caiano, the blue and white terracotta frieze around the room. In the very center, you see the Bellerophon taming Pegasus from Vienna, which is the only signed sculpture by Bertoldo. The only other signed object by him is a medal. And on the right, you see the Hercules in Modena, and on the left, you see the 2 shield bearers. The exhibition, like most exhibitions at the Frick, was connected to research in advance of the exhibition. I traveled with my 2 co-curators, Alexander Noel, who was a Poulet Fellow at the Frick, and with my colleague Amy Ing, curator of the collection. And we traveled around Europe to look at every single Bertoldo object. Here we are in Vienna in the conservation studio of the Liechtenstein Palace, looking at the shield bearer and comparing images. We were also accompanied by another member of our team, Julia Day, who is a conservator, and Julia examined every single bronze by Bertoldo. One of the great essays in the exhibition catalog is about Bertoldo's technique. And Julia was really the first person in the world to look at every single Bertoldo bronze that we know of, and examining the materials, the way these objects were cast and chiseled and created. So here we were looking at the Liechtenstein bronze. And what became very clear is that while the Liechtenstein shield bearer and the Frick shield bearer are made out of the same type of metal, the same alloy, they're decorated in similar ways. Both of their surfaces were gilded. The Hercules in Modena is actually made of a slightly different metal and was never gilded. So technically, we're convinced by now that these 3 objects did not go together. There were 2 pendants, Liechtenstein and Frick, and the Modena Hercules, probably made for the Este family as a separate piece. So here are the 2 companion pieces. These are in the exhibition at the Frick. This was the very first time, as far as we know, since the 19th century, when the 2 objects were displayed to the public together. And you see that the figures are in contrapposto, as you say in Italian, so 1 leg forward, 1 leg back, slightly curving with their shoulders, but they're also meant to echo each other. And in this way, they're obviously facing each other with the shields facing each other. They could have been displayed the other way around, turning their backs on each other with the shields outside. And we decided simply, because of aesthetic reasons, to display them this way, but we tried it the other way around as well. And we don't know how they would have been displayed originally. Were they part of a larger ensemble and they were fixed to something, a piece of furniture, a fireplace, an object of that kind, or were they actually portable, movable objects that could have been moved around? The shields, the one on the right, the one on the Frick shield bearer, is in fact a reconstruction, a restoration. It's not an original shield, but we know there was a shield there to begin with. The Liechtenstein one still has the original shield, and you can see that there are grooves in it, and that it's actually sort of shallow, and that there could have been something inset in it. So the suggestion is that there were actual coat of arms, probably colored, made out of enamels, that would have been inset in these shields, or maybe even other metal work, like niello, which is a typically Florentine type of metal work. But in any case, there would have been inserts with coat of arms originally, which are now lost. And we don't know who the family who commissioned these two objects is. We don't know if there were two different coat of arms of a husband and wife, or if they were coat of arms of the same family, if there were Medici coat of arms, if there were coat of arms of another family in Florence or abroad. So we now call them shield bearers, but for a long time, these figures were identified under a number of different categories. So they often appear mentioned as wild men. And wild men go back to the Middle Ages in terms of iconography. Here is a very beautiful ewer from a peer reviewer at the Cloisters in New York, which shows at the top, I show you a detail on the right, one of these heraldic wild men. Heraldic wild men are creatures of the forest. They're usually old and bearded. Their body is covered in hair, and they often hold a club, and in this case as well, a shield, which you can see from the dots was originally also inset with presumably the owner's coat of arms, the owner of this ewer. But the wild men appear in a number of other images. This, for example, is a leaf of the Hours of Etienne Chevalier by Jean Fouquet. This is at Chantilly, and you see these two wild men, again, naked and hairy, bearded, with their clubs on the floor, holding this inscription in the Hours. And there are several representations of these wild men in this Book of Hours. Another example, slightly later from Bertoldo from the sort of 1490s, is these two wings of the triptych of Oswald Krell, which was made by Dürer, by Albrecht Dürer, and it's now in the Alte Pinakothek in Munich. And you can see again that these two fully bearded, hairy creatures with clubs are also holding coat of arms related to the Krell family. The figures have also been associated with the figure of Hercules. And of course, we saw the Hercules on horseback in Modena, but especially the Liechtenstein figure could also be Hercules. It has a club. It doesn't, however, have the lion skin that usually is associated with Hercules. These are two small, beautiful panels by Antonio del Pollaiolo, which were made for the Medici family because Hercules was also associated in many ways with the iconography of the family. And you see Hercules and the Hydra on the left and Hercules and Antaeus on the right. But in both of these cases, Hercules is wearing a lion skin. So that is the difference with the Liechtenstein sculpture. Another important object from around that time, and this is from the early 1500s, from about 1501 to 1505, is this very large, wonderful fireplace for the Gondi Palace in Florence, which was made by Lorenzo's favorite architect, that same Giuliano da Sangallo, who designed Poggio a Caiano and a number of other Medici buildings. And on top of this huge fireplace, you see these two stone sculptures, slightly smaller than life-size, where the one on the left, again, is a bearded, naked figure with a club. And again, it's unclear if it is Hercules or if it is, again, some sort of wild mythical creature associated with, in this case, the coat of arms of the Gondi family, which appears, in this case, painted on a shield above the fireplace. So back to our two mysterious sculptures. Did they actually have an identity? Are these heraldic wild men from the north that have been classicized in some way? So instead of being the fully hairy figures of medieval Germany, they have been made to look more like ancient sculptures by Bertoldo. We have to remember that Bertoldo, of course, had German origins. So the iconography of the wild man would have been something that he would have been particularly close to. He would have known quite a lot about it. But in this case, is this a classicizing Italian spin on the more northern iconography of the wild man? Are we looking at identifiable figures? So is the figure on the left Hercules? But why is he not wearing his lion skin then? And what about the figure on the right? Is it a faun? Is it a satyr? Is it Pan because of the Pan pipes? So there's been a number of ideas around this, and it's even been suggested at one point that the figure on the right is a faun dressed up as Hercules. We have to remember, however, that in the 1470s, 1480s, around the time when these sculptures were made, classical antiquity was not as well known as it is today. The Renaissance was the time when the rediscovery of antiquity was taking place. And even scholars were often having great debates about how to represent specific gods and goddesses and various heroes of antiquity. And even figures like Pan, like satyrs, like fauns, appear in slightly different guises. So, for example, satyrs and fauns are often represented with goat's legs, but not always. So some of these iconographies are not codified by this point. And this is very early on, not only in the rediscovery of antiquity, but also in the production of these small statuettes. We still have a lot of questions about how these statuettes were displayed, how they were used, where they were placed. Not only these two by Bertoldo, but many of the other small bronzes by Bertoldo and by his contemporaries, like Pollaiolo, for example. So part of the mystery, part of the enigmatic nature of these objects is also due to their being incredibly innovative and new objects for the world of Renaissance Italy. So I hope you've all enjoyed the Bertoldo exhibition. If you've seen it, again, like all of our exhibitions, there is more material online on our website, and I encourage you all to visit that and see lectures by my co-curators and by other scholars around Bertoldo di Giovanni. And I encourage you to read the catalog, and you can see also a virtual tour of the exhibition online. So I hope you're all enjoying your daiquiris, and I hope you're all enjoying the summer, and I look forward to welcoming you next week with another episode. Cheers.